Welcome everybody to the Gouventa show on YouTube with John Capone, and today we've got Lina Liakou, who is the Managing Director for Europe and the Middle East for the Global Resilient Cities Network. Lina leads the resilience practice in Europe and the Middle East for the Global Resilient Cities Network, pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation, working with the 21 member states across the region in developing their resilience, thinking through long-term city resilience strategies and actionable initiatives. Before joining the Global Resilient Cities Network, Lina was Deputy Mayor and Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Thessaloniki in Greece. And as Deputy Mayor, Lina Liakou initiated collaborations with the European Commission, the EIB, and the World Bank. So she's a prolific expert on the way cities have been handling the COVID-19 crisis. Lina, welcome to the show. It's great to see you. I really wanted to get your input today to get some insight as to how COVID-19 has kind of affected global cities and this whole concept of resilience. Well, what does it actually mean in this context? What does resilience really mean? If you can explain that to us.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great being here. Well, resilience is the ability of a system, of the city in this case, not just to survive, but to overcome and thrive regardless of the different shocks, stresses, disasters that the city might face. So I think that resilience at this point is very aligned with what is happening globally. And for us, we've been working in the resilience sphere as a network of cities for the last 6 years, trying to support cities in embedding the resilience thinking into their processes and into their governance structures. And mainly this happens through the appointments of these innovative positions of the chief resilience officers. So we work with a community of chief resilience officers that are embedded in local authorities across the world. Now, COVID, we consider it as the biggest resilience challenge of our generation. Let's say, first of all, it is a challenge that impacts all cities across the globe. And also impacts very different systems within a city. So we've already seen that this is not just a health crisis, but there are all the different systems, whether this is the vulnerable populations, whether there is the urban and built environments, the economic space, that are deeply impacted by this crisis. So trying to understand, first of all, how you respond to that in a way that is inclusive is one. And second of all, how you actually recover through this in a way that it strengthens your ability to further address any kind of shocks or stress that future might bring.
So my next question really to you is, how does a city actually prepare for these kind of events? I mean, I know I've got an article that you were quoted on, it's a Euronews article about climate and how that's kind of affected the way, cities have kind of organized themselves, and it's quoting Athens and Greece, where you were from. How does a kind of a city leadership even prepare for something like this, where you've got lockdowns of the workforces, you've got the schools all shut down, you've got public transport, running at reduced capacity and under social distancing? What's the kind of game plan there? How do you guys, work on? What's the thought leadership behind all this?
So resilience, in a sense, needs to be agnostic to the different shocks and stresses, because we literally, what happens, and the calamities of the future are unpredictable, and we've seen it. So what is important? There are two elements here. The one is how you actually create the necessary governance structures internally to be able to, with agility, to adapt to the different kind of situations that exist. So this has to do actually with how you ensure horizontal communication and collaboration among the different departments, how you ensure that you have the right data at the right time, how you have built already your networks with the civil society, with the private sector, in order to be able to mobilize them when the crisis happens. And the second element is exactly how you, in a sense, in the times of peace, you are able to prepare and strengthen what you already have, what is your communities, because the stronger these communities are, the stronger your city is, the better it will adapt and will respond to the different crises. Now, for COVID, there is an interesting case here, because local authorities usually don't feel responsible for a health crisis. In most cases, this is a national government responsibility. This is almost in all cases. So cities didn't perceive themselves as important actors in this field. But this situation specifically, and this pandemic, highlighted how actually their role is more important than ever. And we've seen how cities are at the front line at this point in responding to the crisis. And when we say responding, it's not just being able to prepare the ICU and enhance the health systems, which indeed is a responsibility of the central government, but it's actually how you support your vulnerable populations, how you support your elderly, how you support your small and medium enterprises, how you manage your mobility system, which is one of the most fragile systems that we've seen in the countries, how you ensure food security for your population. So cities at this point and during the response had to deal with these kind of things. What was interesting is, because this was a global issue, and because the crisis kind of was moving in a different time frame and in different regions, cities were able to learn from each other. So this is why our also role was significant, because we had and we were able to provide them the right space for credible information sharing. And we saw how, for example, what happened in Italy actually influenced the decision making in other cities across the globe.
Right. So if we now, the next question I've got to ask you is, in terms of your organization, have there been active discussions about how the populations start to return back to their schools, their offices, their businesses? Are there case studies of cities globally who are starting to reintroduce populations back to work in schools that are working, that you can speak about, or is it still too early to even have a discussion on that? What's your line on that issue?
No, it's not early at all. And if the previous weeks we discussed about what are the response measures, at this point we're talking about phase 2, we can say the unlocking phase. And I think what is interesting in this crisis is that this is not a linear crisis. It's not just there's a disaster and then we need to recover from it. There are many kind of ups and downs in that. So cities are actually trying to define what are their unlocking, let's say, strategies. And the main, let's say, themes that have come is one is, of course, education and schools. So again, although national governments usually define whether a school will open or not, the local authority is responsible on how the school will be managed and will open. So, for example, in Italy and in Milan, although schools will not actually open until September, they are trying to organize summer programs for the pupils throughout these months, and they want to use their green spaces, their parks, their schoolyards as places to have this kind of programs for children. So they use actually the outside space. This, of course, creates additional questions and problems, like if there's a heat wave, do you have toilets? How do you distribute lunch? All of these things. But they understand that they need somehow to ensure the well-being of their pupils. Now, in Paris, for example, and in France, it seems that some of the schools will open. So there is a question here how this will happen, what are the sanitation protocols that they need to take, what is the role of the teachers, and so on. And we've seen some examples, especially from the Nordics, where they open but in smaller classes, they open in an alternate day, so not all children don't go on the same day to the school, and so on. In general, what is, I think, very interesting, and Milan has already articulated in their phase 2 plan, is this kind of, we need to create a new rhythm for the city. We need to extend our working hours. We need to extend the hours that shops can be open. We need to change the rhythm of the way that we use public transportation, and so on. Another issue that has been identified, which we've seen it also a lot in the media, is the urban mobility. And there are two elements there. The one is how we promote people cycling and people actually walking to their work or whatever they want to do. So we see, massive pedestrianization of streets. We've seen massive creation of cycling routes. Actually, things that we've been advocating for years, we see them happening in a week, which is massive. And it's very, very interesting. I think that's why I like the positive aspects of this crisis. On the other hand, how we deal with public transportation is still an issue. And there hasn't been a solution here, because on the one hand, you have, like, especially in London, you have commuters coming into the city, they need to take public transportation. But how do you make this public transportation feeling, how they can feel safe? Because in reality, it's very difficult to create social distancing within public transportation. And the second element that has also been identified is the financial aspect of that. Because how can financially, TfL, for example, how they can financially sustain the network if they need, for example, to operate with more wagons for longer times with less people.
Yeah, it's especially in London now. I mean, looking at where the here and now, it's I think we're still far off from going back to the commute, back to work, how it was a few months ago. I think there's a lot of fear amongst the population about going on the tubes, about kind of re-engaging to that. So the city administrations, if they do make the decision of relaxing and starting to get people back to work, have to create the trust and the confidence amongst the population to start using public transport. So that's a big one. Let me ask you a question as well now. As you're a Greek national as well, how do you think the Greek government have handled the COVID-19 crisis, and how has Thessaloniki and Athens dealt with it? I mean, what's your view as a former deputy mayor of Thessaloniki?
So first of all, I want to say that I'm really impressed, and I'm really proud of the way that the national government has managed this crisis. I was really impressed of how data-driven and scientifically driven the governance response was, and I think that was the main element. They heard, they listened to the experts, and they moved very, very quickly. So that's why Greece is at the point where they can recover more quickly, and they can go back to normality more quickly than other cases such as the UK. Now, specifically in local authorities and in the two cities, I think that they tried to build on the assets that they already had. So there were programs, for example, where civil servants went to elder houses and support them with bringing them food or bringing them medicine. Like this was already a program that, to be honest, some of the people in the municipality even wanted to kind of disregard it because they thought it was like too expensive and so on. And now, during the crisis, this was actually identified as the most important program to support the vulnerable population. And at this point, they try to bring and leverage resources in order to respond it. Having said that, there are two elements that especially Thessaloniki needs to address. One is mobility, because this was an existing stress for the city, as we also know. So it is very crucial how we don't go back where everybody just uses their cars. So how can you do that? And this is like micromobility can help and so on. And the second element is economic restructuring, especially for the SMEs and the tourist sector.
Right.
Because especially both cities have been their economic base is based on tourism.
So just the closing, in terms of, because I've asked this before to kind of Athens-based experts, and you're in London as I am. What lessons can London learn from Greece? I mean, has Greece done something differently in terms of dealing with COVID-19? The city administrations, have they done something particularly well that London can take on board, that they can learn, or is it two different dynamics? Are we talking about chalk and cheese here? Is it completely, different, scenarios? What's your take on that? Because it'd be interesting to hear from you as an expert on this. No,
it's definitely they are not different scenarios, and I think especially in this period we've seen a lot how cities learn from each other, and they don't have all the answers. And I will give a very, very simple example of, as you know, Greek cities have traditionally had these open-air cinemas, right? When the new kind of the big cinemas came into the cities, these open-air cinemas kind of started to decline. Now, with COVID, actually open-air cinemas can be a very good asset to continue, part of the cultural ecosystem within a city. A tradition that Greece had that other cities didn't, and the city can build on this, let's say, asset and reprioritize and reevaluate this kind of cultural assets that we have. So this is a very, very simple example of how other cities can learn from something that was part of our tradition. So this again is a very simple example, but we've seen both in how we deal with the vulnerable population, on how we deal with issues around supporting the local economies, that cities need to learn from each other, even if that means that they don't just copy paste what they do, but they get inspired, or they co-design together something.